Survive Global Game Jam.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone. Unfortunately, this is going to be my makeshift microphone for the day, but yeah, I'm going to make a presentation about how to survive Global Game Jam, which is, remember again, happening this 23rd, Friday at 5 o'clock at SUNY Albany. It's also happening at MagFest for people who happen to be following my blog. Yes, I'm heading to MagFest to make games, and make games only, and probably not enjoy any of the music there. Anyways, so I'm gonna go through this real quickly. What is Global Game Jam? So a game jam is basically kind of like a marathon run of making a game in a short amount of time. Specifically for Global Game Jam, it's held around the world, and it's a challenge to create a game in 48 hours. Registration is required for every site in the Global Game Jam. I have a link here for SUNY Albany, which I hope is the right one. This one at least lets you know. Gives you a link to PayPal because it costs about I believe now $15 to register. You can also pay up to the door, so if you're one of those lazy people, they're going to ask you for $15 in cash over there, or check, I assume.
Has anyone who's going actually successfully added Albany as their site? No, you can't. Okay, we've deliberately locked that down.
Yeah.
Because I tried to do it today, and I was like, all right, well, I guess
for other
we're actually going to have that be something the jammers do on site there.
Mm-hmm. So, in case anyone didn't hear Brian there, for people that are specifically going for SUNY Albany, who happens to be living in the capital region of New York, the site for globalgamejam.org for that jam site is currently closed. They are doing that on purpose, so you do have to go to this website that right now is showing up on the Twitch screen and on this TV screen right here. Thank you. The other locations I've mentioned that I'm going to the MagFest version of it are listed in the globalgamejam.org website, so check it out there. The rules: you're allowed to work alone or in a team. I highly recommend working in a team because that's kind of like the most important aspect of the Global Game Jam. As you already know, create a game in 48 hours. All code and assets must be open sourced under the Creative Commons license. I listed the exact name under here, the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 International License. 3.0 is also accepted as well. But long story short, that one says that you must, if you're going to use that project, you must share it in the same license, and you're not allowed to use it commercially. Global Game Jam organizers specifically themselves has said that you're completely allowed to once you created that project, your team owns that source code and assets, so you're allowed to make a commercial project after that. The reason why right now it's under Creative Commons license is because they want to be able to create some sort of advertisements, such as, you know, posters, banners, and videos of previous projects as well. So that's why there's that license. Just a reminder that means that if you're taking any code from some location, or if you're taking some photographs, it can't be like it has to be an open source version of it, because you have to open source it at the end. So a lot of the code that you paid for, or that are like really commercial, usually they don't let you do that. So keep that in mind. The most important thing, of course, when you go to a game jam, if there's any, like, just one thing that I want you to get out from going to Global Game Jam specifically, is to have fun. If you're not having fun, then, you know, what's the point? But, you know, you want to go in with a Global Game Jam with a lot of excitement and anticipation. You know, it's not a good idea to be worried about it. There's no reason to be really unsure, really scared of failure, or any sort of that kind of stuff. The second most important thing you want to do in the Global Game Jam is to learn something new, especially for people who are starting Global Game Jam for the first time. If this is like the first game that they ever made at all, there's an excellent opportunity to learn how to use a new tool like a game engine, or maybe a GIMP, or some sort of tools that you haven't used before. It's also a great time to learn how to work towards a deadline, such as setting up milestones and so forth. I'll be going into these in more details, but by the way, this audience I'm talking to has already seen the extra credits video, so they know what I mean when I talk about that. And it's a great time to also learn how to complete a game. For more experienced people like me, it's also a great time to learn how to use a new tool that I haven't used before, or making something new and different and kind of experiment with all sorts of different games that I haven't made before. So up to this point, I made a twin-stick shooter. How about me making some sort of first-person shooter, or a 2D platformer, or 3D platformer, that kind of stuff. It's always a good idea to challenge yourself in these kind of events. It's okay to completely fail. Global Game Jam is not a competition. If you lose, I mean, there's no lose condition. There is no win condition either. Some jam locations do have prizes, like, you know, audience popularity. I know the one I'm going to give prizes to everyone, so everyone is a winner. But besides that point, treating it like a competition is very anti-thematic. It's very against the whole point of Global Game Jam. A Global Game Jam is supposed to be a shared experience where you talk about, hey, how I was able to make this, or how much I struggled to make this kind of things, or how satisfied I am to create this kind of thing. So treating it, you know, as a competition is really not ideal for these kind of things. In the case that you happen to fail, there's compo.hub.net as your backup. Don't worry, there's plenty of game jams going on in the world. So the number one skill that I consider is the most important out of all the skills that you can possibly learn for specifically game jam is to be able to manage your time. By this, I mean that, you know, have at least one person in your team keeping track of the time and making sure, okay, now we have 12 hours to finish our game, now we have 2 hours to finish our game, and so forth. It's worth noting that specifically if you're going to be planning on, you know, trying to stay on schedule and so forth, then the first few things you want to do is to be able to judge how much time all the essential stuff are going to take, as well as how to save time as much as possible. In this case, it's going to be preparation. And for essentials like staying healthy, you need to sleep, you need to eat. It's highly recommended that you do both of these and don't skip on either of these. Actually, it's kind of essential. I don't want you to die in these kind of events, so please don't do that. You want to account for 16 hours for sleep and 5 hours for eating. Total, that is, seeing that it's about, this happens in the 3-day time span for every location. And for bundling, when I say bundling, I mean, like, you know, compiling your things and pulling together your screenshots and trailers. You want to account for at least 1 hour to compile and create all of those executables. You're probably going to inevitably find some bugs every once in a while, so that's why there's an hour gap there. You also want to submit at least an hour before the deadline of the submission for Global Game Jam. I believe technically Global Game Jam stays open until like the last time when 5 o'clock hits on the last time zone. So assuming you're not living in that specific part of the world, you have almost all the time you need to start submitting your work. But the reason why I say you should submit an hour before that timeline is because it almost always bogs down, and it's incredibly slow, and your upload that should take only about, you know, 15 minutes will take hours on end. So at the earlier so you submit these, the better.
One good follow-up to that is you can always resubmit a better version later.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
just get a working version up at the deadline, but you can always polish it up a bit as long as you still have time.
Yeah, one time people were asking me in the Ludum Dare presentation when was a good time to submit. Is it okay to submit snapshots? And the short answer is yes. It is in fact highly recommended that you start submitting snapshots of your game as soon as possible. Now, specifically for Global Game Jam, I'm a little cautious in recommending that because Global Game Jam has a very specific way that they ask you to bundle your stuff. So you're probably going to want to wait until the organizers tell you, okay, this is how you need to bundle your game, this is where all your project code goes, and so forth. I'll go over that a little later. Anyways, when we do the math, we notice that the amount of time we take for, you know, staying healthy and all those kind of essentials takes about 23 hours, which means that the total development time, 48 hours minus 23 hours, is 25 hours. So you're looking at 25 man hours. What I mean by man hours is one team member's number of time duration that they can work on for a team. How to be prepared. You want to be kind of set and committed to a tool that you're going to be using for Global Game Jam. So there's plenty of online resources for free tools in the case that you're kind of a poor person like I am. But you want to be able to search for any kind of free tools and commit to one of them and learn them as soon as possible. I will eventually write this up in the YouTube video that we're going to export here, but I already sent a huge list of links on the Facebook site, so I highly recommend checking that out under the Tech Valley Game Space stuff there. Did I also put that on the page as well? I think I put it on the Tech Valley Game Space Facebook page. Anyways, the tool, huh? Yeah. Anyways, the tools that the category of tools that you want to specifically look for are game engines, art tools, sound effect creation, and music composition. I have a bunch of examples there, but I'm going to go ahead real quick to save a little time. Back to time management. Usually when I go to a game jam, I kind of schedule all of my milestones in half days. So we have the first half day being the brainstorming, team building, and the prototype stage. These actually happens in rapid succession, so that's why I kind of call this a single milestone. The second half day is the feature implementation. You kind of come up with a list of features you want to implement and start implementing them. The third half day being the level construction, and the last one being polish. So the brainstorming stage. This is the first thing that you're going to encounter first. The organizer will say, okay, we'll give you 1 hour to start brainstorming on stuff. When you want to come into a global game jam, you probably don't want to come up with some sort of game idea that you want to create from the beginning. Why? Because ultimately the game idea that you have is not going to match the random theme that they're going to announce at the end. And you might be thinking like, oh, the theme is going to be some sort of word, but Global Game Jam specifically has been very crafty in their presentation. Last time it was a poem, but before that it was a sound effect of a heartbeat, and then even before that it was an image of Ouroboros, the snail eating his own tail. So they are incredibly unpredictable when it comes to what kind of theme is going to be announced. So don't bother, there's no way to predict it. I wouldn't even attempt to try to make your game idea that you had in mind crammed into that theme and realize that it doesn't really work. There's also a huge benefit in not coming up with a game, or not coming into the jam with a game idea, because you now have a more open mind. So you'll be more open to ideas such as walking simulators, which I know a lot of people don't like, but I mean it's a genuine game narrative technique, and I've seen several games that does a really good job of using those. So, like I said, you want to keep a really open mind to it. You want to be open to any kind of games that you want to create there. You shouldn't insult somebody else's work either, by the way. That's a complete aside, but yeah. Still going on with brainstorming, the most important thing is scoping. This is extra credit by and far has this wonderful video about that, but long story short, the best way to look at it is you're not going to be able to make any sort of like AAA console games, or even for that matter AAA mobile games either, but stuff like Angry Birds or kind of like Threes is actually a pretty good reference point to the kind of games that you want to make. The games you want to make basically are some sort of demonstration, a mini game, or an experiment that helps convey the idea that you had. If you're trying to make more than that, if you're trying to make like something that's really bombastic, explosive, and doing all sorts of random things, I would stop there. You don't want to go that far into polished details. You want to make sure that you want to be able to create this with a team that you have, which is probably going to be two to five in 48 hours, and that's just not plausible. Brainstorming, I don't know if Brian and Jamie are going to hate me for this, but I personally don't recommend writing a design document specifically for Game Jam. I should clarify when I say that by saying, you know, when you hear game design document, you think about writing 5 pages of documentation on what the game is about. No, you really don't have the time to do that. Your game design document, at best, is going to be a one single description of what the game does. Don't even bother to spend much more time than that in designing. When you're coming up with your game idea, you want to make sure that it's about it mentions how you're going to play the game. This is going to be infinitely easier for specifically the programmer or at least the engineer working on the game to really organize his thoughts on how the game should be created. So that's why I highly recommend this. I already have some examples there. Platformer, twin stick shooter. I mean, these are like really short descriptions of how you're going to play the game. That's totally fine. I have this one incredibly long one called Suddenly Thousands, called Control a Bunch of Synchronized Character at Once While Taking Advantages of Their Strength. That's totally fine too. I'm not judging you on that regards. So personally, I have 2 methods of coming up with a game idea in a short amount of time, especially in that 1 hour time frame that your organizers give you. Method 1 is the brain dump method. I highly recommend this for software engineers as well, who happens to think like, oh, I want to be able to create some sort of unique, different, productive app ideas. But here's the idea: you grab a bunch of paper, lots and lots of paper. I take like 20 sheets myself. The organizers already set your timer to 1 hour, and you write as many single sentence descriptions of games as possible. So this can be like a platformer where you die a lot, you know, kind of like Super Meat Boy, or maybe it'll be like a twin stick shooter where your enemies are all cats. Just keep on going like that. Notice that the game ideas I've mentioned kind of suck. That's fine. You're going to have a long list of these descriptions. And eventually you're going to hit a few of them where you think like, wow, that can actually be a really good idea. So after when the organizers say your hour is up, it's just a matter of now you have this huge list of ideas. Which one do you think is the best one? You just simply select the best one from there. And not only that, you also have a few backup plans later on should emergency rise. So that's why I really push for this method myself. The second method, if you're not exactly of the creative type that can write sentences in very quick intervals, there's a different approach that I took a few times, and it actually works pretty darn well. I call it the Peter Molyneux method, named after the parody Twitter account of Peter Molyneux. And what you do is you ask like a really stupid question for a video game. Such as, for example, this one where it would be like, what would it be like to throw your own head? It's completely ridiculous. Nobody's going to bother asking that question, but you ask that anyways, and you try to kind of think of a solution to answer that question. So I'm a programmer. I've been taught to say, you know, every software that I'm making has to be a solution to a problem. This is kind of framing your idea on that specific mindset. So now you have this question that, granted, nobody has a problem with, but nonetheless, it's a question no less, and now you're designing a solution to that. Next part of the phase 1 is team building. This is actually the most exciting and the most unique part, in my opinion, of Global Game Jam. So I highly recommend using the best out of this. First thing that you're going to be doing is you're going to be going up in a line and presenting your game idea to everyone. You want to make sure that when you're describing your game idea that you can describe in 5 minutes. Just describe that it's going to be played like this. It's going to this is going to be what's unique about the game, and that's about it. So make sure keep it short, keep it concise, so forth. Don't worry if you don't have a game idea within the 1 hour mark. Like I said, this is going to be the most exciting point where you can just kind of join into a team that you think has the best game idea in your opinion. So I would highly recommend listening carefully to each of these people presenting their game ideas and see if any one of them piques your interest. Also, this is a quick note here. If you haven't made a game before, the organizers are there to help you. Feel free to ask them questions. They are more than happy to help you. So, yeah. When you're going to be building a team specifically, you're going to want to build team off of a game idea, not a team based off of whether you're friends with each other or whether you have really good connections with each other and so forth. It's totally fine grouping up with strangers. The reason why I say this is because you want to make sure that your entire team is really excited about the game idea. They're really when they hear the game idea, they're like, oh, wow, I want to make it. That's a good sign. That's exactly the kind of people you want. That way, a lot of people will, your entire team will all be on the same page when you say, I want to create this feature, or when somebody else says, I want to create this feature. Will that feature help the game? So, yeah. It allows you to really help frame the project in a nice, small, tight, and concise way. I don't recommend making a team that big. 5 is my limit. At 6, my productivity degrades heavily. But personally, in my opinion, the team of 3 is by and far my favorite size. But here, I recommend it in the slides between 3 to 5. It really doesn't need to be bigger than that. Jamie and I can talk about what a terrible idea it was to have a team of 8. I can talk about what a terrible idea it was to have a team of 7. It's just that when you have that many people, you now start having managing problems. You have to actually tell people, okay, these are the tasks I need you to do, and so forth. And that's just really, really tiring. So the less people there are, the better, but 2 and 1 are kind of sad and very difficult to go through. Brian says, bah. To be fair, I've done Ludum Dare enough to know that that is a non-issue for me, but I don't recommend that for beginners. And during the team building exercise, once you kind of build up a team, you want to clearly present yourself with what your strengths are. What can you do? Let the team know, and that way it's going to be a lot easier to figure out who does what. And yeah, basically that's it.
Game Jam, at least in the Albany's site, you'll actually have on your name tag like little stickers representing what your various skills are.
I believe also in the MagFest one, they do a unique way where you write down your name on a post. You write down your name and job thing in your post-it note, and you get to post it on the projects themselves. So there are places where they're carefully organized this. There are also places where they don't carefully organize this, and I've been to those too. But regardless, you want to tell them right off the bat, this is what I do well, this is what I don't do well, this is what I can do. The sooner your team knows this, the much easier it's going to be in the long run. The last part is going to be the prototyping phase. This is going to be, in my opinion, the most important 3 hours you're going to spend on this game jam. If you fail on this one, the rest of it is going to be very miserable. Extra Credit has this wonderful video called Fails Faster, but the whole idea is that you want to create this demonstration of your game idea. It doesn't have to have win condition, it doesn't have to look good, it doesn't have to be even all that playable. What you want to do is make sure that it conveys your game idea well, in a very short amount of time, like I said, and that the experience is what you expected. Now, I wrote here fun, but if you're trying to create a walking simulator where you feel horrible for playing it, then you want to make sure that the gameplay that you create, the prototype that you created, conveys exactly that feeling. So, be open-minded about that, but for this slide specifically, I wrote fun. So what does a prototype look like? Here's an excellent example. I made that image on the left in 2 hours. You can probably tell 2-3 hours. And as you can tell, it's supposed to be Flappy Bird for a game that I made called Not a Clone. But the important part is I really didn't bother to fix too much about the aesthetics. All I wanted to make sure was that was the game functional. Can I make this in a short amount of time? Because Not a Clone was a a mini-game collection of 26 mini-games, and I wanted to make sure that I can make it within a month for the 1 game a month challenge. So that's why I made this. That's why I made it in such a stupid, hardly recognizable thing. Here's another twin-stick shooter prototype that I made. This one actually took me a day. That was probably not a good idea. But just to let you know, these asteroids, these little circles that you're seeing on the screen, that's it. That was the only thing I had in the game. They don't even move. They don't spawn new ones. And I just wanted to make sure that the control feels great. the whole prototype here was really to make sure that I can get the controls working, that I feel like this was a fun game or not. And this is what the final product looks like. It has an actual background with stars, the enemies are clear and distinct, they actually randomly generate instead of those having just 6 things, and so forth. It's also worth noting this game didn't have a win condition either. Once you destroyed all 6 asteroids, that was it. You can just fly around and do nothing. This is a Ludum-Dare prototype I made. I made that in like 3 hours at most, probably 2. You can tell that aside from the super sick cell shading that I was really proud about using, there's almost nothing interesting to watch here. It's just a bunch of colored blocks and things. But I wanted to make sure that I can make this in a short amount of time. I wanted to make sure that this was actually a fun game that I wanted to create. And this is what the final product looks like. Looks absolutely nothing like the previous game, with the exception of super sick, awesome cell shading, but that's about it. So as mentioned earlier, you want to put something playable fast. Presentation does not matter at this stage. So I know that's going to make a lot of artists and music composers cringe hearing that. They're going to be like, oh, that thing looks so ugly. But that's fine. That's totally okay. You still have the rest of the game jam to work on that. What's important is to make sure that what you're creating is what you want to create first. I mentioned here, don't be afraid to throw out your prototype if it does.
For the artists and musicians out there, the benefit of seeing a prototype that early, as much as it is ugly, it gives them something to work off of, so they know what their art should be like and what their music should be like.
Right. So I don't know if you can hear Brian from this microphone, but to repeat what Brian said, another advantage of having a prototype is that it gives a very good visual and auditory reference to how sound effects creators and art creators can reference to say, okay, these are the work I need to do. As mentioned earlier, you shouldn't be afraid to throw out a prototype. If you notice that your prototype is not doing what you thought it would do, it's totally fine to throw it out. You only spend about an hour or two on it. I would highly recommend that if it just doesn't work out, then move on to the next game idea that your team had that you think you guys can agree on to work on. I can let you know that has happened to me at least 2 times that I've attended to Global Game Jam. There was one game about tower defense game where you had limited bombs and you had to use your entire keyboard to detonate them. We threw that prototype out because the controls was really stupid and instead made it into you throw a ball on your keyboard to drop a bomb and watch the whole thing, watch these buildings collapse Angry Bird style, and that was a much better game. I would also keep note of any sort of bugs or any sort of happy accidents that you find, because sometimes these turns out to be more fun than the game itself. So keep watch of those and discuss it with your team if you find that a bug is something that you want to keep or not, or if you want to make that the game itself. I know there was one game in Ludum-Dare where a guy was like, yeah, he clings on walls. I don't know why, but I don't care. It's a feature. And actually his game turned out more fun because of that. So it's totally fine to do that. Phase 2. Finally, we're done with the first half day of making a horrible looking game that demonstrates your idea and you feel good about it. Phase 2 is about feature implementation. This is where you talk with your team, brainstorm on a list of features that you want to create, and basically these features, when I talk about it, you want to discuss like how does it improve the game and so forth. At this point, I also highly recommend setting up a sort of a task tracker. Trello, we've already mentioned this earlier, but Trello is the one that we here at Tech Valley GameSpace use, so I highly recommend that. After that, you want to look through that list. Once you got that list of features in there, you want to look through it and figure out which one is going to be the most important. So you basically want to prioritize this list, reorganize it so that the most important stuff is at the top and the less important stuff is towards the bottom. And after that, you just go through each of those tasks in order. When you're programming together, drawing together, or creating a sound effect together for each of these features, you want to treat them as if they are a prototype on their own. What I mean by this is that you want to be able to create that feature in less than an hour, as the extra credits video says. You want to be able to create that feature in less than an hour, pull it together in the game, and then see if it improves the game as you expected. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it actually makes the games worse. And if you only spend about a small amount of time doing that, the better, because it's going to be easier to revert your code right after that. So, that's the method that I like to use for feature implementation. It's just another prototype on top of that prototype. I also, I didn't mention this earlier, if it takes more than an hour, feel free to drop it and skip to the next feature, so long as that feature doesn't block any other crucial features as well. This is kind of best left up to your judgment, but most of the time, most of the features that you're going to come up are not blockers, so it shouldn't be a problem. Finally, phase 3 is level construction. Now, this is obviously dependent on the game. If your game is more about, it's supposed to be an arcade where it's going on infinitely, then levels will be more like stages. How far are you in the game and so forth. Anyways, for specifically designing levels, I start using the pencil and the graph paper. There's frankly I don't know of any software that does a good job of doing level design that allows you to make it in a short amount of time. So, and there's also the fact that the advantage of pen and paper is that you can easily show it to people instead of saying, hey, look at my computer screen. So it's usually a good idea to start using those. When I do this, I usually sketch out some sort of like a aerial view layout of what the stage is going to look like. Maybe write some notes about this is supposed to be the second level and so forth. But something rudimentary that lets you know this is kind of the layout, this is kind of the experience that it's supposed to be. Which leads right up to, what should a level do? A level should convey a story. A level should convey an experience that you had in mind. I would not make a level that's just like, oh, this is where a bunch of enemies goes in. That's a bad idea. You want to say, like, the user walks through this corridor and starts panicking because this room has a lot of enemies in it. This is kind of like the way you want to create your level, because at least that way there's a sense of cohesiveness and style that's going on. This is the tip that I took from Nintendo themselves. When you start designing on levels, I would recommend starting with the middle and the last part first, because most of the time you'll have these complex ideas of what your game mechanics are, but you're not really sure how they all fit together. So you want to create these middle levels first to get a better idea of how each of these, so that later on when you work on the first few levels, you actually have a better idea of how to tutorialize, how to teach the player to become more accepting of your game. The first few levels, these are my strategies on approaching that. I'm sure Brian has a few suggestions too, but for the first level, usually the way I like to do it is I just put them down on an open field. I tell them push WASD or the arrow keys to move, like right off the bat. I will not assume at all from whoever player it is that they know how to play an FPS game or a platformer or that kind of stuff. The keyboard has way too many buttons, and I'm assuming you're going to be using a keyboard. Just let them know they need to push the control stick or they need to push the arrow keys or so forth to move. They're not going to, chances are very good they're not going to know, so you might as well let them know right off the bat. Usually a first level is a good place to kind of let the user practice how the character moves. And notice, by the way, up to this point, I only talked about character movement. That's literally the level that I create. It's a goal in front of you, your character, you just move around, and that's it. So that way, nothing is distracting them from the finish line and so forth. It's going to be simple. It's going to be very quick and easy for the person to complete, and it's going to be a very minor annoyance for people who already know how to play an FPS to say, oh, that's just it. Okay, fine. Second level is the point when I start introducing a unique game mechanic that is specific to the game. I'm personally an experimental game developer, so that's why I like to use this approach. But this is a good point to finally say, okay, yeah, this is how to shoot, bang. Or like, okay, yeah, this is how to throw your head, bang, so forth. You still want to let the player kind of get used to the player movement at this point. Excuse me. You still want to make sure give a little time for the player to kind of get used to the movement at this point. They only had one level to go through, and probably they only went through that in a few seconds. So you want to give them a few more seconds to kind of get used to that. And obviously, when you're talking about the second level and you're saying like, oh yeah, this is how you shoot, you want to make sure that you kind of force them to figure You obviously teach them through instructions, but you kind of force them to practice on that a bit, not too long, maybe a few minutes, to kind of understand how that game mechanic works as well. And then the third level usually is my starting point. I say, bam, this is the reason why you're playing the game. So at the third level, like if you're making a shooting game, that's when you start dropping all those enemies that you've created, mostly the easy ones, just so that they can feel good about popping a ton of heads off. Or like for the throwing the head game idea, I'll finally present a point where you have to throw your head at a switch and then keep that head on a bucket to make sure it's weighed down so that your body can move, and so on and so forth. This is kind of like a point where you say, hey, this is why you want to play the game. This is why my game is interesting. At this point, like you want to make sure that the first two levels only take at most 5 minutes to go through. If it takes more than that, then in my personal opinion, you kind of lost the player's attention, because those two levels, obviously, as you can tell from the description, aren't going to be all that interesting. Versus the third level, which is like, wow, this is why I'm playing this game. This is why this game is so crazy that I want to play it. That's kind of like the story flow that you want to achieve at that point. The last phase, finally, that we're done with the whole level construction part, is polish. This is going to be a pretty easy part. There's a good point to start replacing all those placeholder sound effects and graphics that you had in your game. Artists and sound effects and composers, finally, it's your time to shine at this point, so get at it. I also highly recommend Googling what we mean juice. There's a great presentation called Juice it or Lose It, but for programmers and artists and all those people here who doesn't know what that means is any sort of feedback that helps the player feel more in control of their game. These are simple things like animations, where if the character is being hit, that animation is being exaggerated, any sort of flashes, camera shakes, based off of a certain control scheme that your character is doing, any sort of explosions, because everybody likes explosions, even ask Michael Bay. So all that sort of fun, polished stuff that makes a game feel gamey. There's also obviously a good time to start doing bug fixes and to adjust the level difficulty to make sure that there's a certain level difficulty ramp going on instead of zigzags, because you don't want zigzags happening. And finally, submission. This is at a point where I don't particularly remember well how the process went, and every site is going to go through this step by step anyways, so I'm not going to go too much into detail, but long story short, you want to make sure that all your project code, all your project artwork goes in there, as well as your executables, your trailers, and your screenshots. These are, I have here the list of information that you need for your game. Obviously a game title. I think you need to put like a text file that says the description of the game itself. The organizers will let you know where you need to put your project code and assets in. It needs to be in such a way that if the user opened up a game engine, they can easily just load up that project file and immediately be able to tinker around with that game if they feel like it. I would also, the said text file with a description also needs to provide an instruction on how to play the game, and compile the game if need be, and executable binary code as well. Optionally, there's screenshots and trailers. I think most locations are going to ask you to put that in anyways. Calling it optional is kind of a bad idea, because quite frankly, you want to put those in there from the first place. So that kind of goes back to the whole hour submission. While the programmer is twiddling their thumbs waiting for the thing to compile, you might as well ask this artist to start taking screenshots of the game or composing artwork and trailers and so forth. Other advice, make sure that your team members' understanding of the game idea and features are consistent. This is kind of like what I said earlier. You want to make sure that all your team members are in the same page. So when you're talking about a feature, when you're talking about a feature saying like, hey, maybe we should have this point where this boss level where he has like 12 arms and each of them do something independently, and the programmer's eyes start twitching. That's a good idea that you probably don't want to implement that feature, because there's a certain sense of doubt or uncertainty going on at that specific interaction. Obviously, you want to express all those sort of uncertainty and doubt. Be honest as much as possible when you're having these interactions with these team members. Any sort of feature where everyone is like, yeah, that's a great idea, that makes them react to a feature saying, oh, that's a great idea, is always a good sign. At least that way, you know everyone is on board in making that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a team, right? One person will be grudgingly working on something that they don't want to work on, and that's not good. The only exception I can say to this is programmers making bug fixes. I know, it sucks. You have to do it. Also, when you're assigning jobs to each person, you want to make sure that you're dividing your jobs based off of category of work. I highly recommend having one person designate as a designated artist, one person as a designated programmer, and one person as a designated sound effects person. A better way to kind of word this is make sure that the jobs that you're doing don't conflict with each other. If you have two artists, make sure that both of the artists knows what they're doing, and that they don't end up making the main character, for example, and now they're going to be fighting over which main character is better or something like that. You don't want that happening. You don't want jobs to overlap at any time you're constructing your game. Have one person keep track of the project schedule. This job is actually incredibly easy. Go onto your computer, set up Google Calendar or whatever, and then pull a little time tracker, or your iPhone for that matter, and set up a timer saying, okay, now it's time, now it's the 12-hour mark, now it's a 2-hour mark, so on and so forth. This is going to be the person that's going to be reminding your team that they should be this far. And it kind of have like a sort of a penciled down moment at places where it allows you to say, all right, forget it, we're not going to be implementing any more features after this point. As part of the preparation, I would start bookmarking websites that to get libraries of graphics, sound effects, and music. I know you're going to be having artists and music composers there, but it's a good idea to start using these kind of reference points as placeholders, especially if you're a programmer. At least that way you can quickly have some asset to put into your game. And lastly, where you always want to have graphics and sound effects, some way, some form, something to tell you feedback that someone was hit, something to tell you feedback that you were hit, something to tell you feedback that you have this much health left, and so forth. Having placeholders at all greatly increases the interactivity of your game. It's part of juice. So you definitely want to put those in there as soon as possible. You don't want to skip over sound effects. I know a lot of people do that. Bad idea. You got to have sound in your game. So that ends my presentation, and we have a bunch of excuse me.